as much as a book or a journal article or even a newspaper headline has a title or the headline, they all have that kind of one thing in common, which is they have a focal point. They have something which pulls us to it. So it might be the title on the cover, or it's likely to be the kind of the title at the start of a chapter or whatever. But it's done deliberately to create a direction of travel. And so one of the things that's fundamental to your infographic is making sure that you've got a focal point. And you have to think very carefully about your focal point. There are various examples that you've perhaps seen in other videos of where this occurs, but you have to think very carefully about making sure that the focal point also fits in with what has been referred to in other videos, which is the idea of where we want the journey to go from. So you have to think consistently about the kind of the text alignment and the image alignment as well as the focal point. They very much are almost in a symbiotic relationship. So the aim here is about getting the message across. So you have to think, where do you want the focal point to be? So what is it that reinforces the key message of the infographic? So it might be that the key message of the infographic actually is the title. And there is another video which is about the way in which you might construct the title. So it might be that it's what we call a top-down infographic, so that the key message comes first and then everything else that sits underneath it kind of conforms to that message. It might be the kind of approach where it's what we call an inside out. So in other words, it's the middle of the infographic where the key message exists, and then everything outside it relates to that message. So you have to think about this, as I say, in relation to the notion of colour theory and also the notion of the messaging and the tone. And then you have to think about what it is that's going in. You know, clearly in these kind of infographics, we generally are trying to, particularly in science, we're trying to get across data or statistics. But you also have to think very carefully about the way you convey that. Now, as a society, we are very much information hungry. So people are going to scour the infographic for sources of data and sources of information. So this is why that kind of alignment that we've referred to in previous videos is important, because you've got to make sure that they're following the track or the trail that you've set them on the infographic. So the eye studies show us actually that text summaries rather than graphs is what people are drawn to. So if you think that the best approach is to put really complicated pie charts onto an infographic, please think again. But it doesn't mean that vast amounts of text work. What it means is that actually just having small chunks of text actually seems to be more appealing to people. People are drawn to those. And again, thinking about the notion of scaling, make sure that you scale things so that if it's an important variable, it's larger than a less or a smaller variable. So let's have a look at this kind of getting message across using focal points in our examples. So this is a really obvious one. So this is an inside out. So here you can see that the message, the focal point has been achieved in two ways. Firstly, it's been achieved by using the largest font. And secondly, it's been achieved by having a very different colour to everything else that's in there. So it's the only part of the infographic that is in this kind of browny orange, but it's got that very large font. So in other words, it's telling you what the focal point is throughout pregnancy. Aim for 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity every week. And then everything else that comes from that relates to that message. So that is kind of an inside out based approach. If we look at something like this infographic, the focal point is very, very consistent. So you're drawn automatically to those four coloured blocks, and they are bolder than the title itself. And that's because that's where the primary information is. That's where the primary statistics are. But notice there are no numbers. Remember that what we referred to is the fact that studies show us that people don't really relate to numbers, but they will relate to perhaps some writing, which we've got here, and these donuts that have been used, again, are just there to kind of symbolize. Remember, it's about just showing rough proportions, and it's trying to show roughly how much of this, in this case the event is aerobic and anaerobic. So the focal point here is one could argue, I suppose, this is an inside out to a certain degree, but really almost all the information is tied up within those images that we've got there. On this example here, this is a really nice example of a focal point. Now, this is quite an interesting one. I would hazard a guess that you're automatically drawn to the large image of the person who's injured. So you're drawn there initially, but the track helps us keep on the trail that we want. And notice there's much more writing on this infographic than we've seen on previous examples. Again, conforming to what we know from the eye track studies, which is actually having small blocks of text, like you see here, actually does come across quite well. It's not data heavy, it's not graph heavy, it's text. This would be classed as being text heavy. So there's not a lot of writing that's going on the infographic, but at the same time, we've got a clear focal point that we can look. The focal point's quite interesting. It's been done by using the title with that white strap at the top. So we are drawn. I suspect this is a slightly curious one, that I suspect actually if we did an eye tracking study, that some of you may be drawn to the icons on the left and icons on the right. But in essence, what they're want you to do is how active are we? And the reason, the way they've achieved that is it's a larger font and it's got that white background to it. So now it leads you in, bleeds into those sections below. So that becomes the focal point. But interestingly, one can argue that there is also a focal point, if you wanted it to be, which are the two greeny blue blocks as well. But because everything's on a grid and is connected, it's allowing us to kind of move around the infographic. It's not overly complicated, and there's previous videos on about preventing overcomplication as well. So it allows us to kind of have a little bit more of a free-flowing approach to where our... So on this one, this is quite an interesting one. This one is perhaps overly complicated in terms of where is the focal point. Actually, having looked at this a number of times, the focal point is that trophy that's in the middle. And that's been achieved in two ways. One, it's quite a large image, but secondly, it's because it's the only image that's got that that unique colour, that kind of golden yellow colour. So that becomes the most, obvious focal point. And so you then drift from that. And so what it's doing is, this is again kind of an inside out infographic, that everything then spreads from that point that you see there. So make sure that when you are constructing your infographic, that you're thinking about where and what the focal point is. Is the focal point image based? Is the focal point going to be really what, the kind of the take home message? And I think, as I say, the best example you see of that is in this infographic here, where it really stands out. Now, it's not saying you do an inside out, but making sure that what you want the reader to take home is really obvious. And it's about connecting the messaging to the colours, to the alignment with the focal point.